A city of 5,000 people, apartment blocks, a school, a hospital, a pachinko parlor, a cinema. Streets so narrow that neighbors could reach across and touch each other's walls. And underneath all of it, tunnels dropping into blackness where men spent their lives pulling coal from the seabed. Then, in a single decade, every one of those people disappeared. The city still stands. Nobody cleaned it out. Nobody demolished it. They just locked the gates and pretended it had never really existed. This is Hashima Island. And the story of what happened there is one that a major corporation and an entire government spent decades trying to control. The island sits 9 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan. From a distance, its silhouette looks like a battleship cutting through the East China Sea. That's not an accident. The locals called it Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. The concrete seawalls built to keep waves from swallowing the whole thing gave it that profile. A man-made fortress dropped into open water. 16 acres of engineered land that should not exist at the density it achieved. At its peak in 1959, Hashima was the most densely populated place on Earth. Not one of the most dense. The most, more than 83,000 people per square kilometer, a figure that still hasn't been surpassed anywhere on the planet. They were packed into concrete apartment blocks built so close together that sunlight barely reached the lower floors. Children played on rooftop gardens because there was no ground-level space for a playground. The island had no soil to speak of, no natural vegetation, no fresh water source. Everything had to come by boat. Food, water, building materials, workers, and the workers came because Mitsubishi told them to. Mitsubishi bought the island in 1890. The coal underneath it was extraordinary. Submarine seams running deep under the ocean floor. High-quality fuel for an industrializing nation that needed energy faster than it could produce it. They built the infrastructure quickly. Japan's first large reinforced concrete building went up on Hashima in 1916, not in Tokyo, not in Osaka, on a tiny island in Nagasaki Bay, because Mitsubishi needed to house miners somewhere permanent, somewhere they couldn't easily leave. That word matters. Leave. Because for a significant portion of Hashima's working history, leaving was not something everyone on the island had the right to do. Between 1939 and 1945, the Japanese government mobilized forced labor on an industrial scale. Korean civilians were conscripted under the National Mobilization Law. Chinese prisoners of war were transported and put to work. They ended up in mines across Japan, and a significant number of them ended up on Hashima. Estimates vary. The documentation is incomplete by design. Korean government records suggest roughly 500 to 800 Korean laborers worked on the island during the war years. Some died there. The exact number is disputed, partly because Mitsubishi's records from that period are not fully public, and partly because Japan and South Korea have never agreed on what those records actually show. The conditions underground were specific. Tunnels extended as far as a kilometer below the ocean floor. Temperatures in the lower shafts reached 30 degrees Celsius, with humidity close to 95%. Men worked in wet heat so intense that sweat couldn't evaporate. The coal seams were thin in places, narrow enough that workers had to lie flat to reach them. They swung picks in spaces too small to stand upright. Methane gas built up in the tunnels. Rockfalls happened. Injuries were routine. Medical care was minimal. Above ground, the picture looked different. A functioning community with schools and shops, a hospital and a bathhouse and a place to drink after your shift. Mitsubishi provided all of it. They owned all of it. And that distinction mattered in ways people didn't fully articulate until much later. When the company provides everything, the company controls everything. The apartment you live in, the school your children attend, the hospital where your wife gives birth. You are not a resident. You are an asset being maintained. Hashima's population started declining in the 1960s as petroleum replaced coal. The economics that had made the island worth building simply evaporated. Mitsubishi closed the mine in January 1974. They gave workers a few months' notice. By April of that year, the last residents had gone. The island was sealed. No caretakers, no maintenance crews, just locked gates and open water, and 50 years of wind and salt working on the concrete. What they left behind is extraordinary and slightly disturbing. Classrooms with textbooks still open on desks, kitchens where dishes were left in drying racks, a barber shop with its chair still positioned facing a cracked mirror, personal belongings the residents couldn't carry or didn't bother to. Everything stopped on the same day, and nothing moved after that. The buildings are collapsing now. Concrete returns to aggregate when no one maintains it, and the sea air accelerates the process considerably. Floors have fallen through. Staircases lead to open sky. But the overall structure of the city, the grid of streets, the bones of the apartment blocks, persists in a form that is still recognizable as a place where people lived. Japan opened Hashima to limited tourism in 2009. A narrow coastal path, a viewing platform, a guided tour covering a small portion of the island's edge. Visitors could see the ruins from a designated route, but could not enter the buildings. The interior was off-limits for safety reasons, the structures being genuinely dangerous after decades of zero maintenance. But safety wasn't the only reason for the limitations. What people could see from the coastal path was curated. The guided narrative that accompanied the tour was curated. The story of the island that Japan was preparing to take to the international stage was very deliberately curated. In 2015, Japan nominated Hashima as part of a cluster of sites to be inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The nomination described the sites as representing the achievement of Japan's Meiji industrialization, the speed with which the country transformed from a feudal society into an industrial power. The nomination succeeded. Hashima was inscribed. The problem was what the nomination did not say. The forced labor history was absent from the initial framing. The South Korean government raised formal objections at the UNESCO committee session. The Japanese delegation, under international pressure, committed publicly to ensuring the full history would be acknowledged in interpretive materials at the sites. They used the word victims. They made a specific commitment. Then, they didn't honor it. An information center opened near Nagasaki in 2020. Its exhibits, reviewed by historians and Korean officials, described wartime labor in language that minimized the coercive element. It suggested workers came voluntarily. It omitted testimony from surviving laborers and their descendants. South Korea filed a formal complaint with UNESCO. The World Heritage Committee issued a decision in 2021 expressing strong regret that Japan had not fulfilled its promises. The committee asked Japan to provide a progress report. The island kept receiving tourists. The boats kept running from Nagasaki. The heritage designation remained intact. What you are looking at when you visit Hashima depends entirely on which story you've been told before you arrive. From the coastal platform, the ruins are genuinely spectacular. Layers of concrete stacked against ocean sky, a vertical city suspended in decay, the kind of image that stops people mid-scroll. The tourist infrastructure understands this. The boats are popular. The photography is excellent. The aesthetic reality of the island does a lot of work on behalf of the version of history that emphasizes industrial achievement. Decay is beautiful, in a way that makes it easy to forget what the functioning version of the place demanded from the people inside it. The survivors are still alive. Not many, but some. Korean men now in their 80s and 90s who were brought to Hiroshima as teenagers, who spent years in those tunnels, who came home to a country that spent the following decades navigating a complicated relationship with Japan while their specific experiences were quietly deprioritized in bilateral negotiations. Some have given testimony to South Korean historical archives. Some have spoken to journalists. A few have appeared in documentary films that Japan has not screened domestically. Their accounts describe conditions that don't appear in the official interpretation materials. Beatings for inadequate work, food withheld as punishment, the inability to communicate when you speak no Japanese and no one around you speaks Korean. The disorientation of working a kilometer below the ocean floor on an island you cannot leave without permission, you will not be granted. Mitsubishi has never formally apologized for the wartime use of forced labor. The company has acknowledged that labor mobilization occurred. That is a specific and deliberate choice of words. Acknowledgement without accountability. The documentation of what happened has been left to historians, to survivors willing to speak, to researchers who access South Korean archives because the Japanese ones are incomplete. The island was designated a cultural treasure. The people who built it under coercion are subjects of a diplomatic dispute. There is a specific kind of power in controlling how a place is remembered. Hiroshima is visually arresting in a way that overwhelms the impulse to ask questions. The ruin does the work that architecture once did. It imposes a mood. It suggests a story. And the story it most easily suggests is about impermanence, about the rise and fall of industrial civilization, about the poetic quality of things humans build and abandon. That is a true story. It is also the most convenient one. The other story requires you to look at the apartment blocks and ask who lived on which floor and under what conditions and whether they chose to be there. It requires looking at the mine shafts and understanding what it cost a human body to work in them for 12-hour shifts in 1942. It requires asking why the records are partial, who made them partial, and what a company with a 150-year history and ongoing global operations has to gain from a particular version of its past. Mitsubishi still exists. It is one of the largest industrial conglomerates in the world. Hiroshima is now a tourism asset. The photographs taken from the coastal platform appear regularly in travel magazines and architecture journals and listicles about the world's most haunting abandoned places. The aesthetic has been fully absorbed into global visual culture. The history is being actively negotiated at the level of international diplomatic frameworks. These two things exist simultaneously, and the gap between them is the real story of the island. The buildings are not going to last much longer. Engineers who have assessed the structures estimate the most deteriorated sections could collapse within years. What happens when the buildings that anchor the heritage designation become structurally irretrievable is a question no one is publicly answering yet. But the testimony that exists doesn't depend on the buildings. It's in archives in Seoul and Tokyo, and in the recorded interviews of men who are running out of time to give them. It's in the UNESCO committee records that document a government making a commitment and failing to keep it. It's in the Mitsubishi corporate archive that researchers have spent decades trying to access fully and haven't. The island looks like an ending. The empty hallways, the collapsed roofs, the silence where there were once 5,000 people. But the questions it raises are not finished. Who built this, exactly? What it cost them? Who profited? Who controls what it means now? Those questions don't get answered by a UNESCO plaque or a guided boat tour or an information center that leaves out the parts a corporation would prefer remained unspoken. Hashima didn't decay. It was left to decay deliberately by people who understood that a locked and crumbling island is easier to manage than the truth of what was built there and who built it. The concrete remembers even when the official record doesn't. And the people whose grandfathers went into those tunnels and didn't come out the same are still waiting for a version of the story that includes them.